Hey everyone, today I'm going to go over the new runes Valley tanks are getting in Phase 2 of SOD, and then we'll look at some potential builds. First, I should mention that there's a new Quality of Life spellbook coming out this phase that will make your blessings last twice as long and cost half as much mana. This is honestly the thing I'm looking forward to the most about Pally's next phase. The 5-minute high mana cost blessings were a nightmare. Keep in mind a lot of the stuff we're going over today was data mined and it's subject to change before Phase 2 goes live. The new rune slots this phase are Waste and Feet. In the Waste slot, we're getting Sheath of Light, Infusion of Light, and Enlightened Judgment. Sheath of Light will cause your melee attacks to give you a spell power buff equal to 30% of your attack power, and it lasts for 1 minute. It also causes your crit heals to put a heal over time on the target for 60% of the amount healed. The main part of this rune is essentially touched by the light from Wrath. Instead of 60% strength conversion, we get 30% attack power, which is pretty similar since you get 2 attack power for every point of strength, but it's a bit better because there are quite a few things that give us pure attack power, such as Blessing of Might, that the Wrath version wouldn't convert. Fully buffed, a Phase 2 Bisque-geared Pally can expect to gain about 270 to 290 spell power from this if they're gearing for strength. This is a fantastic rune and will only get better. Infusion of Light increases the damage of Holy Shock by 20% and causes Holy Shock damage crits to reset the cooldown on Holy Shock and Exorcism and refund the mana cost of the Holy Shock. This is really interesting for a Shockadin build, which could end up being competitive damage in PvE. Enlightened Judgments increases the range of Judgment by 30 yards, making it 40 yards total, and increases your spell hit by 17%. This could potentially be used at some point for things like 4 Horsemen for taunt hit. Currently, leveling raid bosses are only considered +2 levels, and many new items have spell hit, so most or all of this spell hit is wasted. In the foot slot, we're getting Guarded by the Light, which causes us to restore 5% of our max mana every 3 seconds for 15 seconds anytime we hit with a melee attack. While we have this buff, healing from Flash of Light, Holy Light, and Holy Shock is reduced by 50%. This is basically just Divine Plea with the Guarded by the Light talent from Wrath. The one difference is we don't actually have to use an ability to initially activate it, we just have to melee something. In Wrath, we occasionally run into the awkward situation where the Divine Plea buff falls off and the cooldown isn't back up yet, but that won't be an issue in SOD. This is a great rune that will essentially give us infinite mana. The Art of War is another new rune that causes melee crits to reset the cooldown of Holy Shock and Exorcism. If you don't need the mana from Guarded by the Light, this is the best offensive option for this rune slot. It of course synergizes incredibly well with a Shockadin build, but it's still solid without Holy Shock. Our last option is Sacred Shield, which works just like the Wrath version. It places a buff on the target that gives them a 500 damage absorb when they get hit, and has a 6-second cooldown on the effect. It also increases Flash of Light crit chance on the target, and Flash of Light will apply a heal over time. The Wrath version of this spell has 75% spell power scaling, so it might be the same here. This ability is already great in Wrath, but it's going to be insanely overpowered in a low-level classic setting. If you thought nothing did damage before, wait till you have this on you. It's likely not something we'll often take for ourselves, but we'll benefit from Holy Pallies having it. Now let's look at a few potential builds. Prot unfortunately looks like it'll still be pretty useless for raids this phase, but who knows, maybe there will be tons of opportunities in Nomer to tank lots of mobs at once, and block and AoE tanking can shine. Keep in mind this is all just fun speculation. I don't know how things are going to shake out. The first one we'll look at is the Shockadin build. Shockadin was traditionally a PvP spec, but it looks like it could have real PvE potential with the new runes. For this build, the main component is going to be a fast one-hander and high crit chance, so we can get a large volume of crits to constantly refresh our Holy Shock and Exorcism through the Art of War and Infusion of Light procs. Our ultimate goal is to just spam Holy Shock and Exorcism. This will of course be mana intensive and possibly unrealistic, but Pallies do get Judgment of Wisdom this phase. With this build you might use Seal of the Crusader for faster attack speed, and there are several other new sources of attack speed this phase too. The new world buff interestingly gives pretty much perfect stats for this build. If Seal of Martyrdom crits end up proccing Art of War, that'll likely be the go-to seal. Martyrdom just got buffed from 30 to 40% weapon damage and gives twice as much mana back now. The mana is only going to be a small increase, but Shockadin is going to be a mana intensive spec, so every little bit helps. I have Divine Storm in here for now, since theoretically it will give us extra chances to proc Art of War when Holy Shock and Exorcism aren't up, but if it doesn't and Seal of Martyrdom also doesn't, we could use Horn of Lordran for more crit. For the leg rune, we're obviously going Exorcist, since Exorcism is one of our main abilities in this build. For a chest rune, Hand of Reckoning can be used if we need a taunt, more threat, or mana from hard-hitting bosses. Crusader Strike will also be great if it can proc Art of War, and the mana return from it just got buffed from 2 to 5%. I'm slotting in Crusader Strike for now, but we'll swap based on the situation and how it ultimately ends up playing in the build. For the waste, I'm going to try Infusion of Light to increase Holy Shock damage and get another chance at Holy Shock and Exorcism resets. Note, this one also refunds the mana for Holy Shock, which will be huge for our mana with this build. The other option here is Sheath of Light, which would be worth around 90 to 110 Holy Shock and Exorcism damage depending on gear. I could see Infusion of Light potentially being dropped for the increased damage of Sheath of Light, especially if the various things I mentioned before all end up proccing Art of War, and the extra infusion resets end up being unnecessary. We could potentially run Seal of Righteousness with this build too, which would benefit a lot from the extra spell power. As for talents, we're picking up both of the passive stat increases since we don't need heal pushback reduction. If Seal of Righteousness ends up being the seal to use with this build, then you'll throw 5 points in that of course. Consecration will probably just be used for AoE. It's less damage than Holy Shock and Exo while also costing more mana, so it's unlikely to be used much or at all on single target. We've got a bunch of filler points here with Emplay on Hands, which is a really strong buff, but it's only usable once per raid. Unyielding Faith is just filler, maybe it'll help with something. Divine Favor is a guaranteed crit for Holy Shock, which means we could start a fight with Exo, Divine Favor, Holy Shock to instantly reset our Exo and Holy Shock through Infusion of Light, and use them both again right away. Lasting Judgment is filler, you can put those points anywhere you want. I just put them there in case there's an intermission on one of the new number fights where you won't hit the boss for a bit, and somebody else is putting up Judgment of the Crusader for you. Holy Power is perfect for this build since it just gives us 5% Holy Crit chance to help us reset Holy Shock into Exo. And of course we end by getting Holy Shock. Both Holy Shock and Exo have 42.85% spell power scaling, while Consecration has 4.2% per tick for 33.6% total. That means every 100 spell power will only give Consecration about a 4 damage increase per tick, which is pretty weak in the context of SOD. Since both Exo and Holy Shock also have higher base damage, better scaling, lower mana cost, and can crit, they will always outperform Consecration for single target. Now let's look at gear. I'm sure there's a more optimized set out there, but this is just what I threw together. Basically, our goal is to get a bunch of melee and spell crit, spell damage, and some spell hit. Keep in mind, Agi is still good since it gives us melee crit to proc resets with Art of War. In this set, I've got the Shockforge set, which was designed specifically for this spec. It has tons of spell power and even a 2% Holy Shock crit bonus. Weapon is probably the biggest part of this set. There's a 1.3 speed mace from Lorgus Jet that would get down to about 0.6 attack speed with Seal of the Crusader and the No More World buff, which would give you almost 2 chances a second to get a melee crit to reset Exo and Holy Shock before even considering Wind Fury. With Battle Chicken stacking and other attack speed debuffs like the NG Helm on use, you could get this even faster. The new Epic Sword is interesting too. It's 1.7 speed, so we take a pretty big attack speed loss, but the DPS difference and proc could possibly make up for it, especially if we're running Seal of Righteousness, and those procs could proc the weapon. We also have the Epic Engineering Shield from Nomer. Successful blocks deal physical damage to the attacker, which could potentially crit and proc Art of War too. We just kind of have to wait and see and test all this stuff out. The potential for this spec is enormous, and it's really exciting that a spec like this could actually be viable. The second build we'll look at is a deep Ret build. This is basically just building upon what Paladin tanks did in phase 1, going Ret with a two-hander, but now we get to pick up more damage talents. For the chest rune, we're still sticking with Divine Storm. Leg rune, we're going Exorcist. Hand rune, as always, can be swapped between Crusader Strike and Hand of Reckoning, depending on what makes more sense in the moment. Sheath of Light is the only real option for the Waste rune. It'll give us 270 to 290 spell power and base gear with full raid buffs, which will significantly increase our Seal of Command, Judgment of Command, and Exorcism damage. For the Foot rune, I'm planning for Art of War. I think the Crusader Strike buff will be enough to sustain us with some mana pot use, and anytime we're using Hand of Reckoning on harder hitting bosses, that should cover our mana needs. But if I have any mana issues, I'll swap to Guarded by the Light. As for talents, we're just doing what we did last phase, except we have some more points to play around with. The new points are going into Parry, Two-Handed Weapon Specialization for 6% increased damage, Sanctity Aura for 10% increased holy damage, and Vengeance for 15% increased physical and holy damage. All pretty straightforward, we're just picking up things that increase our damage and threat. It's best to get a movement speed boot enchant and put the 2 points you would have put into Pursuit of Justice into Parry and Divine Strength. That effectively makes your boot enchant 1% parry and 2% strength by saving you those points, which is much better than the 3 agi boot enchant alternative. Most of the set is pretty self-explanatory. We want lots of AP, crit, and hit. For the chest, I'll likely stick with a blacksmithing chest to provide the raid DPS increase. If survivability once again isn't a factor in the raid, the trade between shifting silver and hazard basically becomes 1 strength and a +2 damage debuff on mobs versus 11 agility, and the debuff side pretty clearly wins that. If the extra stam and armor end up being important, you could swap to hazard. The final build we'll look at is a pure AoE tanking build. I doubt this will actually make sense to use in raid, but could be good for mega AoE pulling dungeons or other AoE farming. For runes, we're going Divine Storm for AoE Snap Thread as we're gathering mobs, but if survivability is an issue, you could go Aegis. Avenger's Shield for extra AoE. I have Hand of Reckoning in for raid or dungeon big AoE pull tanking. If you're solo AoE farming, you could change this to Crusader Strike. We're picking up Sheath of Light just to get a ton of spell power to increase our AoE damage. Then we're going Guarded by the Light so we can spam all our mana intensive AoEs without worrying about going For talents, we're picking up Consecration for AoE, and putting the remaining points in Prot to get more threat and survivability for bigger pulls. As far as gear, we're just going for lots of stam, strength, and agi for the most part, so we can get lots of spell power and be tanky enough for huge pulls. The tank trinket could be interesting for a massive pull, so you could get the 1000 armor bonus during your kill phase. And the Pally trinket from Blood Moon is nice for an extra AoE during kill phase. The Damage Reflect chest enchant was not available on 60 up when I made this set, but that would be the obvious choice. We're also getting the Mithril Shield Spike, so we'll have 4 different sources of Damage Reflect between Ret Aura, Shield Spike, Chest Enchant, and Shield Proc. I don't think this build is going to be super useful in raid unless people figure out a mega pull where you can pull pretty much the entire raid at once, but I think it'll be really good for massive AoE dungeon pulls like in SM. Overall, I'm really excited for Paladin Phase 2 of SOD. In particular, I'm really interested to see how Shockadin plays out in raids, but it should at least be pretty fun in PvP, if not PvE. Let me know what you guys are planning for your Phase 2 builds in the comments, and if you think I'm overlooking anything for any of the builds. If you want to support me, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.